Hey guys, it's Horror Free for All, better known as Goosebumps Completionist, and I hope you all are doing well tonight. We are back again with another episode of Goosejunkies, and for tonight, for episode 38, we have decided to finally pick up what we teased a few episodes back that we were going to do. And we're going to be facing off an iconic Goosebumps short story, later turned into a two-part episode known as The Perfect School, and we're going to be facing this off against an iconic and kind of underrated haunting hour episode from the classic TV show known as The Perfect Brother. I am joined tonight with two of the greatest panelists in kids horror podcast history, in my opinion. Micah, aka um, Ultimate Goosebumps Man, and BD, also known as Shiv, also known as the Horrorlander. How are you guys doing tonight?
Yo, people and patrons of the night. Hope you're having a perfect night, a perfect Goose Junkies podcast viewing. Hope you're having, all perfect things happen to you because today the episode's about perfect because both of it's got perfect in the title and the idea of being replaced. But you know who's not replaceable? The three panelists right here. These are guys tied together for life throughout this. So hope you guys are enjoying the podcast. Hope you guys are ready. And I hope you guys are excited about this episode because these are two pretty wild and wacky concepts that kind of do a good job.
Nice. Yeah, I can't wait to talk about these. I think this is going to be one of the more interesting episodes we've had in a while. How you doing tonight, Micah?
Doing great. Just very interesting kind of rewatching Perfect School and watching for Perfect Brother actually for the first time. I feel like I'm going to have some hot takes, but, that's what this
This is
podcast
your first
is
time
about.
actually watching The Perfect Brother?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay, so I wish I had that experience. Some of these as we go along. I feel like I've watched everything TV show wise at least once. So like coming back to these, sometimes I'm like, man, I wish I could watch it for the first time. I envy you on this. But yeah, thank you all for joining, and thank you all listening out there or watching along with us for tuning in for tonight's episode. So, when it comes to perfect themed episodes, there's actually some stories that kind of run similar lines here with like going missing or being replaced in kids horror. And I feel like these two from the big two of the R.L. Stine TV shows, Goosebumps and Haunting Hour, seem like a shoe-in to face off against each other because when you break down the stories, there's a lot of similarities. Specifically with the Perfect School's short story and the Perfect Brothers episode, but there's also similarities there in the episodes too. So the Perfect School, for those that aren't in the know, originally debuted in the third Tales to Give You Goosebumps short story collection in the 90s, and is a story that actually stars an iconic Goosebumps protagonist of the short stories, known as Brian O'Connor. And no, we're not talking about Fast and Furious as Brian O'Connor. Rest in peace, Paul Walker, if you're out there listening. We miss you. But Brian O'Connor in Goosebumps, he is what I guess some people would consider a bully protagonist. He's not the nicest kid on the block, if you get my drift. He torments his younger brother to the point where his parents grow tired of him and they ship him off to this camp of sorts at this private school in the summer called the Perfect School to whip him up into shape, essentially. So when Brian arrives at this campus of sorts, he realizes in the short story that when you act up at this school, the school patrons and the headmaster tend to come down on you hard. And then suddenly, when they come down on you, people seem to change and people don't act like themselves like they were before. And Brian, being the cunning and one of the more savvy characters in Goosebumps, if you ask me, notices this phenomenon and decides to dig a little deep into things because something is not adding up. 2 plus 2 does not equal 4 in this equation. And he slowly unravels a plot unfolding to him that kids are going missing in this school, at least their original selves, and being replaced with something, let's say, artificial and mechanic. And by the end of the story, we get to see what that entails, how many kids have been affected, etc., and what potentially Brian is going to have to deal with moving forward. And we see some sort of arc in that as well. That maybe he's come a little full circle and realizes that he has to, I guess, quit being the anti hero and actually become a full blown hero. in the situation. And I think that's why the short story tends to resonate with a lot of people, is because the stuff that Brian sees in this story involving robots, robot clones, while it can be kind of hokey and 50s science fiction esque, it's still pretty tantalizing in the mind in that existential kind of way. Being replaced, having somebody take over your life, and you suddenly have to, live your life out essentially in a prison cell. That is not what you want to do with your life, especially as a kid. And I can totally see why people gravitated to the short story when they were in their youth. And I just want to just say that I think as a short story, it does what it needs to do. It's a short and sweet, like 10 or 12 pager. It flies by. It's memorable as all get out. Has one of the best Goosebumps protagonists of all time, in my opinion. In that anti-hero role. I love a good horror anti-hero, y'all. I love Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. I love me some Don Chalice. I love The Punisher from Marvel Comics, like anybody else does who likes that kind of grungy, gritty type of anti-hero stuff. This is up my alley. Brian O'Connor is probably the closest thing to an anti-hero we have gotten in Goosebumps that is rootable to his level. And to be fair, the twist of this story really recontextualizes this thing to be a grander thing. And I've always thought that the short story was so good conceptually that this would have made a fantastic full-length Goosebumps book. And I kind of wish it was um, in some facets. Technically, we have gotten some private school stories in Goosebumps, thankfully, to kind of suffice that, what if. But yeah, if R.L. Stine ever wanted to remake The Perfect School, or I guess reimagine it into a full book, maybe in House of Shivers, I'm all aboard for that. So I'm going to pass it over to you guys. If you guys had time to read the short story or have read the short story, what's your thoughts on the short story?
I guess I can go. I haven't read it recently, but I remember back when I read it, I did like it, and I agree with you. It's one of those. See, Tales to Give You Goosebumps has some short stories that are almost like too ambitious that you almost want books out of them, and they come with some really novel ideas that I would easily take some already pre-made Goosebumps books and replace them. I wouldn't mind getting a Perfect School book. Again, the fact that we got a two-parter episode lets you know that the short story could be expanded into something bigger, something better. So I would like it. And I agree with you. It's a good anti-hero role, especially considering that one of the few bully characters that we had is like Todd from Go Eat Worms, and a lot of people don't like him. While in this case, Brian O'Connor is rootable. He's got some redemption to him, and he's got some wit to him, which we always appreciate. And I like the twist. The twist is again freaky, and funny enough, I think that short story, or at least the episode or something, might have at least inspired something involving the Haunting Hour episode, because again, you brought up the whole idea of robots, and robots being such a big replacement idea thing. So, yeah, very good short story. I do want to revisit it, but I remember the last time I checked it out, I did like it, and I wouldn't mind it being turned into something more.
All right. I like what you said there. I mean, I have to agree with like everything you said. Totally. Micah, have you read the short story?
I've actually not read it. No, I didn't have time to read it, and I haven't read it before since I actually don't own the Third Tales book yet. So I know there's ways to read them online, and I just haven't gotten around to it. But I'm curious to read it now.
You can check it out maybe after the podcast or casually at some other point. But I think mainly what we wanted to focus on anyway tonight was like the episodes. These short stories are like 10 to 12 pages out there for everybody out there listening. So sometimes we just include these if we have time. But yeah, it's in my opinion one of the classic, like, and one of the most notable of the short stories from the collection of tales. Not because it got an episode adaptation, no, genuinely because it deserves it. I mean, it's just memorable. Which brings us, I guess, to the episode. The episode is probably the most recognizable version of the story for a lot of people out there. It's infamously known, at least in the collecting circuit, that the DVD had the Haunted Schools cover. So everybody for years kept confusing that The Perfect School was some remake of the Haunted School, and it caused all this, hoopla commotion with that. But I think these years, like especially in these years with like internet being as prevalent, people are able to just to do a quick Google search on it. But The Perfect School was the only two-parter in the original Goosebumps series that adapted a short story into a two-parter. And so the story goes, when they were making season 3, they made Perfect School originally just a one episode thing, but they liked it so much that they wanted to add another episode to make it into a two-parter because they thought it was a really cool idea, and that's why we got a two-parter out of it. And I'm going to pass it over to you guys. Knowing this, what is Perfect School's episode about? What did it kind of change from the short story? Mike, I don't think you can commentate on this, but what did it change from the short story, and what's your thoughts on it? I guess I'll give it to BD here.
Sure. So I guess going over the episode, you essentially open up with the parents going out for dinner. They're away from the house, and you have the little brother terrified of something. You don't really know what he's terrified of quite yet. And then you find out that Brian O'Connor, our protagonist, is hosting one of the most, I think, sociopathic pranks that I've quite seen in kids' horror, where he pretends to do a break-in with the ski mask as like a robber, but at the same time it almost gives you the impression that he's going to hurt the little brother. So it's like one of the most realistic horror scenes, the idea of a break-in, getting robbed, maybe getting injured, and then you turn out, it's the whole, like, this was before YouTube was a thing, but early YouTube days, it's just a prank, bro. It's what he hits his brother with, the 90s version. And of course, as he's caught in the act by his parents, the next day he gets sent off to this boarding school. And when he visits the bus, he sees all these group of kids, and two of the boys stands out. One of them is like super nerdy, like when you get into his introduction scene, he goes like like that type of nerd. And then the other one is this Asian boy reading a comic book with sunglasses, who, I'm not gonna lie to you, since his name's Brian O'Connor, I've always made the joke that that's Han. This is Han as a kid, the cool Asian kid. And they just hook up and be friends. So of course he resonates with this Asian guy, and they end up getting closer together. They kind of stick to each other as like friends throughout the story. And when they get to the boarding school, they're all in their private school kind of uniforms, and they're all in line. And there's this guy who's been at the school for a while, this kid who ends up kind of getting into like a back and forth with Brian, because Brian always finds trouble. He's one of those characters where, like the Fast and Furious Brian O'Connor, trouble finds its way. So he ends up getting into a little kerfuffle, and that kid ends up getting dragged away. And as the story continues, and they see that the teachers and head counselors are very strict, very strange, that kid reappears, but as like a goody two shoes boy, like way too like robotically nice to Brian and apologizing to him. It almost feels like he's on a leash, being guided in like certain types of dialogue. It's that level of like uniform. So it's very creepy. It's very odd. And as the story continues, there's scenes where they'll try to take extra food from like trays that no one's eating, and they'll get reprimanded. They'll be talking in class, they'll get screamed at. And eventually, throughout the story, Brian has enough. He tries to escape. And then he realizes that at that point, the school is a lot more extreme than he predicted. And there might be some underlying scheme going on underneath the school, or in certain secretive parts of the school. And it's quite morbid, quite horrific, but let's just say it's very dystopian at the same time. So that's essentially the plot. What I like about this episode is, one, I love the character of Brian O'Connor. He's the anti-hero in the short story that you root for, but with the two-parter and his actor, he's got a lot more personality, of course, in my opinion, in the episode. You see a lot of his witty remarks. You see him, he's always kind of like a step ahead of the other kids because he's very aware of his situation and surroundings. He's very tricky. He often likes, going behind the scenes and pulling little stunts and stuff to try to get his way. And there's something involving the ending of the episode, which, is spoiler, so I'm not going to give you too much details. But let's just say that he almost has this code name kids next door level intellect and just underlying secret persona that he's able to put on. So he almost feels like a spy, and I like that. I like that kind of over the top, very rootable character sense driven to him, especially when you open up with him doing one of the most sociopathic things that any kid has ever done, and then you make him a hero by the end. It's pretty good.
That
Um,
opening to the episode is so beyond iconic.
it's iconic. It's without a doubt iconic and unforgettable. And we talked about the short story having the robot thing. In the episode, it's not really robots. It's more so like artificial, but it's more so like inorganic material. It's almost like a much more biological kind of approach to it. That sort of artificial, synthetic, human angle, which I think is creepier because you have a scene of like a mutated fetus in a jar, and then you progressively kind of see like human evolution, and then you get an iconic scene where Brian sees a synthetic version of himself, which is horrific. And if you're a '90s kid, if you've seen this episode back then, that kind of scarred you because it made you kind of freak out at how weird everything looked. So I love that part of the episode. And overall, I think that the pacing and structure of the episode's good. I don't have a problem with it. I think that it does a good job building suspense, a good job with introducing you to all the characters, making you care about them. I specifically remember that seeing all the kids kind of slowly turn against Brian was also a really good thing. And that whole idea of isolation, I love boarding school stories like this one. And Are You Afraid of the Dark? The Hatching, because that idea of isolation, you're away from your parents, you're away from help, nobody can save you really. And other stories we've talked about on Goosejunkies have been like that. So this is just a prime example of that. So overall, I'd give the episode probably like a 9.2 out of 10. I think it's a great episode. Maybe it could have been shortened down a bit, but I think overall with the two-parter time span, does a pretty good job, has a good main character, has creepy scenes, and the ending leaves you wanting more. So that's really all you could ask for. So those are my two.
Honestly, the ending to the short story and the episode probably has some of the best sequel bait of Goosebumps of all time.
Yep.
Like the fact that the story never wrote itself is an insult.
Mm-hmm.
And I low key wish we got like a full book follow up these days with it, or maybe like Stein put out like a random short story collection for Goosebumps and put Perfect School Part 2 in there or something. That'd be awesome.
The imperfect school or something is make
Something, the Perfecter School.
Just give us a sequel.
Or the Perfect Schools. I don't care what you want to call it, Stein, but that'd be awesome. But yeah, great synopsis, great points. I mean, I have to agree with you there. I think honestly, I guess I'll pass it over to Micah. But one thing I want to add on to what you said is basically how I feel about the episode is that the whole living and dying by 21 minutes for the old show, including 21 minute episode 1, 21 minute episode 2, 42 minutes or 21 minutes. I think that really did hamper a lot of episodes that could have had maybe just an additional 5 minutes or so. Perfect School is one that I think would have benefited from like a solid 35, 36. Like you didn't need an extra 7 minutes on there. You could have trimmed down a little bit of that later part 1 and early part 2 and been fine. But yeah, I have to agree. Like it does kind of feel like maybe in the middle it's starting to spin some wheels a little bit, taking its time to get where it gets fun. But yeah, I think pacing and structure is pretty well done for what it is. Especially trying to stretch a 10-page short story to a two-parter. That must have been a daunting task. I can only imagine. So yeah, awesome. Micah, I know you probably have a scathing hot take about this episode coming up, given what I've heard you say about it. But let's hear your take on Perfect School.
Well, I am personally not the biggest fan of this episode. I'm not going to say it's a bad episode because it's definitely not bad. It's still like probably middle of the upper half of the show overall. So, it's not like I don't think it's a terrible episode by any stretch of the imagination, but I've just never gotten into it. I think that is I feel like it's a little overhyped in my opinion. I think I'm not a big fan of the boarding school setting. I think it's a little bland. I like the idea of kind of being isolated from people, but I just think the way they handle it and just, I think just the aesthetic of boarding schools is very bland and uninteresting. I think that it's a very slow story as well. Like there's a lot of good moments in part 2, especially with, him discovering the clone room and all that stuff is really effective. I like the ending and I like the opening of part 1. But everything in between those areas, I just feel is very monotonous. It's very slow. I feel like it didn't need a two-parter personally. I feel like everything there just felt like a bunch of unnecessary padding. I feel like even though part 1 obviously is more exposition based, I feel like they leaned a little too hard into that. I feel like, again, if it takes a little too long to get to any of the action or interesting storylines. I like Brian a lot as a main character. I think he is a very fun and, unique main protagonist for Goosebumps, being more of an anti-hero. But I'm not a big fan of the rest of the characters. I think they're kind of just very mediocre overall. It's just kind of an episode I've never found interesting. I think it's mainly because, as a Goosebumps fan, I mainly gravitate more towards like the monster-centric episodes or more like stronger horror-based episodes. This one is much more of a kind of a mystery sci-fi kind of episode, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, but it's not really what I go to Goosebumps to look for. So again, I still don't think it's a bad episode. It's one of my least favorite two-parters overall, but it's just not an episode that's ever appealed to me. I never liked it as a kid, and even rewatching it now, I appreciate more about it, but it's never been one that's really been like one I desire to rewatch.
I mean, I can get that. I these days, after watching 80s Twilight Zone, when I watch Perfect School, I can't help but think that this could have easily fit into 80s Twilight Zone with like how like sci-fi and out there it gets. But the one thing I have to disagree with you on, Micah, is the boarding school aspect for this episode in particular. I think that location is a built-in way to unleash the batshit ideas it has. Like the whole over the top examination room, experimentation room, and all that. That is completely out there and wild for kids horror. When you see the fetus tanks, yes, these are fetus tanks, y'all. Like amniotic fluid tanks, similar to something like the Batfa tanks from Star Wars, what they call them. It looks like that, but with like fucking alien looking fetuses just growing I guess in synthetic bodies. It is disgusting. It is out like I said, it's out there. It makes you squirm a little bit. So I have to disagree because at least with this, Tail to Hatchet. I don't think we've covered that in a face off yet. If we have, sorry, I'm forgetting on it. Maybe we have. But that boarding school had a freaking lazy river below it, right? And you had like eggs floating down. Like I love it when kids horror shows like this do something crazy and off the wall with these settings because often in the night you're like, oh, it's just some school, right? But no, it's something like crazy, covert, and just highbrow going on underneath, and I get a kick out of that. So that's where I disagree. But I can totally see if you're here for like Monster of the Week stuff. This is not a monster focused story whatsoever. It's very like existential in that Twilight Zone kind of way. If you're fans of like Cuckoo Clock of Doom, you'll probably really love this episode. It's probably the closest cousin to Cuckoo Clock in Goosebumps. But yeah, like at least you still have it in the upper half of the show. Because
it's like a 6 out. It's like a 6.5, close
6.5?
to 7 out of 10 for me. But I just think it's very. Yeah, fair. I just don't really enjoy it as much. But there's enough good in it to at least put it at least into the upper like half. It's not like it's a below 5 or anything like that.
Yeah.
I think the thing about it too is like because it's a boarding school, like because they all have the same uniforms, they all look so posh. So when you have like such a posh, like polished, very uniform type of place, and you have all that bad shit stuff going on, it's like the perfect like juxtaposition. It's like a place that should be the most mundane place on earth, but it's not. It's the most like craziest place that you don't want to be. Something about that works.
I can't believe we haven't talked about it, but like when the whole like bus transfer scene happens early on, and you see the headmaster like looking like Count Dooku on the kids, and the guy looks like Christopher Lee. Did anybody pick up on that? I thought that was hilarious.
Yeah, he does have that imposing like look to him. Yeah.
He's like he's looking onward like he's about to like F these kids up.
Again, it's all. That's why, like, even later, this was a cartoon, but Codenames Kid Next Door. It was always like adults are like the evil ones. They're trying to get rid of us. They're trying to ruin us. It's what you had here early on in Perfect School, where all the adults are painted as like the bad guys, like they're trying to mess with us. So.
Yeah, and they're trying to suppress the kids from like acting out in classrooms and stuff. Like you have to like be perfectly facing forward. You have to have your pencil a certain way. You have to be doing everything that they want you to do. It's almost like the story could be actually trying to commentate on something. And that's why I said I think it would be a fantastic full book, especially because the episode kind of points this point out. is that like they're trying to brainwash the kids into being good or they'll be replaced. Like at least they're trying to give them that option, and I think that would be a fun aspect to explore. Maybe with the
Plus,
villains,
you
like
even
being like, we don't want to replace you, but if you disobey, we will. Like he puts his foot down. So
I
I
was
think
gonna
that would
say
be
too, even
interesting.
like Brian's little brother, like when Brian's little brother hits that, like I think he hit that line where he's like no, I want the old Brian back. Like even the idea of having his brother as this like posh, perfect kid, he's like, even though he was the one getting terrorized by his old brother, he's like, no, I don't want to replace my brother with someone who's like, I don't like that idea.
And that's the brilliant afterthought twist that nobody actually sees coming in either version. And I guess we'll kind of talk about it here. I guess we're going to have to kind of give this away to even talk about it a little bit. But I think this is ingenious about the story, is that there's a point in the end of the climax where you're like, oh, Brian's screwed, and then we see in the ending that Brian looks like he's become one of the clones, but then he reveals that he's been acting this entire time
Yeah.
and the real Brian has survived. That just shows how clever this kid is. I mean, like, what other kid have you seen in anything kids horror that could pull that off? I don't think
And
much.
the artificial Brian, because he's in the other spot that the real Brian should be, he's trying to convince the guards, like, no, he did this trick. He did this switcheroo. I'm the, fake Brian. So then the other kids start joining in because they think that Brian's doing a ploy to try to get them all out the cell. And I was like, that's also wonderful because he's almost getting mocked every single day that he's trying to convince them, like, no, this thing really happened. And that's also, I think, like, also reminds me of I'm Your Evil Twin. I'm Your Evil Twin had that on the flip side, but it was a similar type of like you think something is a certain way because of the way someone acts, but then you find out no, it's different.
Yeah, I was about to say there is a lot of similarities there with that book.
It is a
Um,
clone. They're both cloning stories, so there you go.
yeah, but one last thing to point out about the episode. Fun fact: if you're a fan of the Resident Evil movie series, the kid who plays Brian O'Connor in this episode, his name is Sean Roberts. He plays Wesker, the iconic Resident Evil villain in those movies. So, if you like Resident Evil movies and you like Wesker, or maybe Sean Roberts fans out there, this is an early role of his, kind of like a Hayden Christensen kind of thing, or Katarina Skorsgård, or I think Catherine Isabel, various other stars that starred in this show. So that's another fun fact. But yeah, Perfect School. I think I'd probably give it the same grade as you, BD, about 9.2 out of 10. Maybe a 9.4 if I'm feeling generous. I think it's a fantastic two-parter for what it is. It's definitely like upper echelon of kids horror episodes, top 100 probably, if I had to peg anything on it. So yeah, I think we touched on everything that Perfect School has to offer, short story and episode wise. So I guess we'll move on to the episode of Haunting Hour that came out, I want to say, maybe like 14 years after this. So,
Oh,
a good while. But this came out in season 1 of The Haunting Hour, and it's The Perfect Brother. And I know, Micah, since you watched this for the first time, I'm going to pass it over to you. So this is probably freshest on your mind. What was your initial thoughts about Perfect Brother? What's it about? And what did you think about it?
All right, so first going into a bit of the plot of Perfect Brother, it basically follows these two brothers. I can't remember their names. It's Josh and Matt, I believe, are the names.
man.
And yeah, it seems like they're a very close friendship. Opens with them playing basketball in the gym. It looks like gym class, and Matt is this like really prolific, really good player, while Josh is kind of a klutz. He doesn't really play as well. He's kind of humiliated by Matt. And you can tell they have a very close friendship, though, despite that. And, there's a lot of weird stuff, though, going on. When you go home, they go home and they basically have to deal with their parents, who are these very strict, just kind of bad parents, especially the mom. The mom is so unlikable because of how strict she is. And, they have to give her their report cards. And, Josh ends up getting, all B's and like a B plus, and his parents are kind of disappointed in him for that. Then Matt gets all A's, but they're still disappointed in him because he got 1 A minus, which is immediately kind of like this how like really strict, like idealist parents that these people have, where they think that their kid needs to be like 100% flawless, like straight A's, and even an A minus isn't good enough. And it just proves like it makes you really feel bad, especially for Matt, just because like he worked hard, he was doing really well in school, but because he got one A minus, he disappointed his parents, and just really rattles him. And you can tell that when they're up in their room, you know, Josh is just sitting there flipping through some comic books and like legitimately just flipping through. And meanwhile, Matt is like sitting on his computer, I think doing some schoolwork or something. And they're kind of just talking about this and saying like how Matt's upset that he disappointed his parents. And there's suddenly a very weird thing where when Matt stands up from his computer, his leg suddenly gives out and he just collapses. And you don't really know what's going on there. It's really weird. And he starts like talking really weird. He has like these really weird vocal glitches and things like that. And it's something that's not usually what Matt is like. And Josh gets kind of weirded out by this, tries to tell his parents, and they kind of just brush it off and saying like, oh, he's just fine. You know, we'll just deal with him here. And it continues to get worse as the day goes on, as he collapses when they're in the middle of school and drops his lunch. And instead of and basically he ends up getting called out. And instead of taking Matt to a hospital, they just bring him back home. And, you know, Josh is getting weird out saying like, hey, he's obviously not doing well. You need to take him to a hospital. And his parents just keep kind of brushing it off. And eventually he overhears them talking about how like the experiment has failed and things like that. And he's, you know, that obviously throws a big red flag at him. So he starts trying to investigate and figure out what's going on, especially when his parents claim they're taking Matt to the hospital. But after they leave, he ends up calling the number that they called, and it wasn't the hospital. It was it's just like almost like an automated voice telling him to enter some kind of passcode. And so this obviously raises a lot of red flags in his head. And when he goes to investigate this facility, he ends up seeing that it's not a hospital at all when he goes to this address. It is this, you know, really odd kind of scientific quarantine kind of facility. And as he's going around to try and see what happened to his brother, he comes across all of these like kids sitting in these different cells, all like shaved heads, and they're almost being tested for something. And he doesn't really know what it is. There's a lot of weird stuff. He just passes this scene of this girl like screaming behind a cloth as these doctors are like doing something to her. We don't really see what it is, but it looks, you know, kind of violent and looks very sinister. And he ends up discovering that Matt is there being wheeled in on like this stretcher with his lower half covered by a blanket. And so he immediately kind of freaks out and goes to follow him to see what's going on. And he ends up getting the answer that big plot twist here, and a little bit of spoiler work, but it's essential to knowing the plot, is that Matt is a robot. And that, you know, he was never a real brother, and all of his emotions and stuff, despite him actually caring for Josh and them being close, it was all kind of programmed in there into him. And, you know, it almost seemed as he's being faulty because he's letting his emotions get more in the way of him, and he's starting to not do as perfect in class and stuff. You know, he's basically being recalled to be replaced by a better model, pretty much. And so Josh ends up getting caught and taken out of the facility. And when he gets back home, there is a big plot twist involving what happens with his parents and his family. And it's a very dark ending because unlike Perfect School, things don't end up so well for Josh. And there's some very sinister implications as to what maybe could happen to him at the end. And yeah, overall, I think this episode was really good. I really enjoyed it a lot. I like the brotherly bond between Matt and Josh. I really like brother bond stories because I'm very close with my brother as well. So I think that hit home for me a lot. And it's really, you know, kind of sad seeing what happens between the two of them and kind of how heartbroken Josh is over the situation with Matt. And, you know, I think both actors do a really good job. There's probably some of the better child actors in Haunting Hour. And Haunting Hour overall has pretty good child actors. So, and they're more teens, so it makes sense. But I think the parents are really off. Like, you know, of course, the mom is very unlikable and strict. And obviously that plays into the twist later on. You can tell that I like the dad. You know, the dad's a bit more sympathetic for most of the episode and is a little bit lighter on the kids than the mom is. But, you know, again, there's another thing involving that at the end that kind of revokes that. But overall, I think all the characters were solid. I think there's some solid creepy atmosphere when Josh is exploring that facility and seeing how, basically what's going on here and what the robot, like these robot kids being made and programmed and stuff, is really eerie. I think just the idea of what happens at the end, especially, spoiler alert, family all turns out to be robots and they turn on him and turn out that, Josh was actually the failed experiment in a robot family raising a human. And I think, again, that's just kind of a morbid idea, like thinking from the perspective of Josh, having this family that you love and care for, who's pretty much raised you your entire life, suddenly turning against you is just such a genuinely scary thought. And I feel like it's handled really well. And there's a lot of fear. It plays into that fear nicely at the end. I think there's a little fast paced. I will say that's one of my main critiques, is that it kind of, with a lot of these single part haunting hour episodes, it kind of just flies into the plot. You get like maybe 5 minutes of setup before you start getting into the main mystery plot, which is fine. Like, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but it could have used a bit more time to flesh out the characters at first. And yeah, overall, though, I think it is still a very solid episode. I enjoyed it a lot. I probably give it a solid, 8.5 out of 10 overall. I think it's not like one of my absolute favorite haunting hour episodes. There's still ones that I prefer over it, but for what it was still a very solid episode that I enjoyed.
All right, that's a good way to kick it off, because I think we all really liked this episode in some capacity. I don't think we're hardly anything hugely negative to say about it. But I think we're all going to be pretty much where you're at with it. I feel, maybe give or take, maybe some higher skews here and there, but we'll get there when we get there. I guess I'll go ahead and pass it over to BD. I know that you've said in the past that you really liked this episode and you rewatched it before you got on. What's your thoughts on it now for you? Does it still hold up?
Yeah, I still think it's a really good episode because it it kind of did what Black Mirror did before Black Mirror was a thing, and obviously it's homaging Twilight Zone, which Twilight Zone did a lot of these type of dystopian world stories. It's definitely one of the thing I think liked about Perfect Brother is there's nothing explicitly, I guess, horrific about it. It's more so all the implement. I can't say the word.
Implications.
I'm a robot. I've been replaced. I'm glitching out. There's a new model of ship. There's a new Horrorlander model MK2 coming in next week. I don't know why I can say that word, but yeah. So the whole idea of your family betraying you, you not knowing who you can trust. The brotherly bond between these two, like Micah said, is strong. I really like their performance. I like their bond. It's really heartwarming. And even though I'm an only child, I have a lot of my best friends or even other family members who I'm close with. So imagining like two brothers who kind of bond over trauma because they have really strict parents that they don't feel like that they can relate to. That's very like a cool idea, just like seeing them kind of like stick it out together, almost like survival. Um, and the twists involving Matt and what he is and what's going on with them is all pretty dark. And that ending, man, that ending, I feel like has a little bit of that Goosebumps flair, but it goes just darker with it. It just goes way darker. It goes into that whole, what you thought was a situation is not what it is. And they even take it a step further, like having best friends and other people involved. And then it makes you question what's the scale of what's going on. But my biggest weakness to the episode, which I did notice on a rewatch, is the pacing, the time limit. This has always been an episode that I thought suffered from the 20-minute time frame limit. I feel like this should have been one of the episodes that had a two-parter because there were a few episodes in Haunting Hour that got that. Because once you get into the laboratory, there is so much going on and so many questions that just don't get answered. Like, the whole, before you got to the twist, the whole like government idea, the idea that this is like a government experiment, trying to find out how deep does this really run. When you see how many people are involved in the story, it makes you think like, has the town been in on this for a while? Is it beyond this town? Is this like an American thing? And when you see the other people who are getting experimented on inside of the laboratory, like the girl who keeps on laughing, they all have their head shaved. It's like, well, what's the deal with them? What are they doing to them? Or is that part of the augmentation process? Are they doing other experiments? You could really go into deep sci-fi horror if you were to go down that type of route of making it a two-parter. But it just didn't do that. So it more so reserves the story to a punchline story. And that's how I've always felt about this story, is that it's really good, but it's a punchline story. It really, that ending is what sort of sells it. Um, and the twist. But I feel like it stopped from being great because it needed a longer time frame. And I think it's funny that we did pair this up against Perfect School, because we had some reservations about Perfect School maybe being a little bit too long, and then I feel like this one we all kind of have at least a similar understanding that it's a little too short. It needed some more time. But other than that, if you want a I guess kids horror version of a Black Mirror episode or something that feels more like Twilight Zone, go check out Perfect Brother. And I can't lie. As a kid, if I really was like into this episode, I probably would have been so paranoid, because I probably would have thought like, what if my parents try replacing me or some crazy shit's going on? If you're a little kid watching this, I think you might be more paranoid. And also, it has some
Yeah.
commentary about our government, which that's always something to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, I think you had made a fantastic comparison to Black Mirror. I really do think that The Haunting Hour is one of those collective shows, and I think the brilliance behind shows like The Haunting Hour is that you're able to have like your goosebumps kind of stories, like your silly, goofy ones, and then your more serious monster stories. And then you have your Are You Afraid of the Dark esque ghost kind of stories, your urban legend type of stories, creepy atmosphere, creepy looking monster kind of things that are just more than, the schlock that Goosebumps offers. And then you have your stuff that like feels like Twilight Zone, it feels more existential in nature. Then you have your Black Mirror stuff, which is kind of similar but more technology focused and science fiction focused. And then you have a bunch of other stuff kind of coalescing there. And I think the Perfect Brother is probably the biggest shoe in comparison to Black Mirror in the show. I mean, it just feels like this would have been a Black Mirror episode, literally. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Maybe if it had like the budget that Black Mirror episodes usually do and the time limit, it would have been probably one of the best revered Black Mirror episodes. But yeah, I will say this up front. I think that this story, even though R.L. Stine did not write it, I feel like the writers, I think, who were Eric Patterson and Jessica Scott, they wrote a good amount of episodes from the show. The duo did. Um, I think they pulled inspiration from Stein at least. And the obvious one is Perfect School short story. I think they definitely pulled inspiration from that. But I also think they pulled inspiration from a lesser known, but if you know about it, iconic book called um, "Don't Forget Me" from the Nightmare Room. There's aspects of "Don't Forget Me" in this story with the sibling connection about the sibling being afraid of losing their sibling and trying to find out what happened to them and where their whereabouts are. That is very prevalent in the story. And then, we have that Perfect School aspect onto it being replaced and being artificial and being some sort of kooky science fiction plot behind, the whole scheme. It's a perfect marriage of those stories. And I have to agree. While I think the acting performances is fantastic for the show, I mean the two the main guy who plays Josh did an incredible job. Great emotional range. Every scene that he was in, he like stole the show. He was incredible. I recognize him as a character from Degrassi. I think he played a character named Declan, which is funny because that was another Canadian show. But yeah, seeing him here was fun. And I do think that the shot with Matt when he's in the facility when they expose one's underneath the blanket was chilling. Was absolutely chilling. When I first watched this episode, I watched it the night it aired in 2011. I watched it the night it aired. I was hooked on the show at this point. I remember I was like, "Holy crap! The show is still going there. I love this show." I remember seeing that. I was like, "Man, man, man, where's the show been all my life?" Um, and it's still good till this day. It's really unnerving. If I was a little kid watching that, I would be petrified. Um, but that moment also, with Matt telling Josh what's going on and like what he's been going through and like the reality of the situation is one of the most emotional things you'll find in Haunting Hour. One of the most emotional things. And I think if that Deus Ex Machina twist doesn't sell the story for you, I think the inclusion of the bonus twist that comes right after really sends us home into, I guess, iconicness for our Haunting Hour, which is already iconic, but Haunting Hour is well known for dark endings, like dark as hell endings that usually go a little bit further than what Goosebumps would do. Like obviously Mascot, for example, the kid has been in the digestive tract of Big Yellow, or you have episodes like Lots of Luck, where the kid loses in the end and he's basically killed off screen. I mean, Goosebumps does that too, but
Or
you know,
Intruders, where it's the meme where we're
Intruders.
not going to jump you, come outside. That
Kind of,
type of thing.
yeah. Haunting Hour's no shy of that. But what makes this episode dark is that the main character really did nothing to deserve it, if only his humanity and his compassion for his brother cost him basically his existence, which is a very tragic thing. But I think that's something that this episode gets grossly undersold about in the overall community of the Haunting Hour. The story is kind of saying something with Josh's humanity and what he goes through. Especially given that twist when we realize that he's the experiment, he's the human experiment with a family of robots, right? It kind of shows that to go in tandem with Matt and the older models of his parents potentially even, and that's something that I wish was expounded on, and I'll get into that in a minute. But it really does sell the idea that you know maybe Matt started slipping because he started identifying more on his human nature that he was programmed, right? And then Josh, being close to his brother, he wants to save that version of his brother at all costs. And what we get at the end where he realizes that he's lost his brother forever, I mean, like he's basically already thrown his own life away. So, I mean, there's a lot to like pick up with that ending there. And when a story is able to recontextualize something in that degree and make you think back on the whole story and what it was really about and what it was doing, that's incredible. But I have to agree with you, Shiv, here with the length. I had a problem with it this time around. I really loved it the first time I watched it years ago. I mean, years and years ago. But this time around, I was like, they literally just hit the ground running with the story. They throw you right into this family, and I feel like one of the biggest detriments to this is that it doesn't take enough time to build on Josh and Matt's organic relationship, like to see how they really are with each other. I feel like maybe like I'm not saying a lot of minutes, but maybe like 4 to 5 minutes, just building on their dynamic and their dichotomy and their yin and yang in their sibling relationship would have been interesting to see. Because I feel like we don't get enough Matt in the story. And I wanted more of that to feel more empathetic impact with him. And another thing that I think is a good point that you brought up is the whole government angle. That could have easily been expanded on in this bigger way that the episode just couldn't capitalize on because of runtime. And this is I think, a classic example from the Haunting Hour specifically that, and there's quite a few. Like I know Dreamcatcher is one. I think that's a pretty universally agreed on one that probably could have used and benefited a two-parter like Perfect Brother here. And some people out there might disagree that Perfect Brother needs a two-parter, but I'm with BD on this. I think it needs like a longer runtime to flesh out the characters a bit more, flesh out the relationship, flesh out the mystery and the government involvement in all of this. And then coupled with that, addition, I think this would have sent that story into greatness. Because, like you said, this story is memorable because of the double decker twist. Without that twist, I don't think a lot of people would remember this one. It's just kind of in one ear out the other. Sadly, but it is what it is. So yeah, great points. Is there anything else we want to add to the Perfect Brothers discussion before we move on?
I mean, I was
Anybody else
gonna
have
say
anything else
that
to say?
there was like I was gonna say one of the things about it too is just that I think that existential horror that you really get from sci-fi, which I think is really interesting that you see it brought up in kids horror of all things. Where I read this Tim Curran short story recently that involves sci-fi experimenting, and there was a line dropped where I think the person getting experimented on was asking the captor, like, why do all this? Why do this to us humans? We're so intelligent, we're so conscious. And the being had said to them, what is it a lab rat's place to ask the experimenter why they're experimenting? And that's kind of what you get here, where the brother really you see his humanity break down And I think that it's so effective that I wish that's why I wish it almost got a two-parter, because you could have had a lot more lead up and build up to that breakdown, because seeing him think of himself as like a person, I have a family, I have this personality, and then the mother, who's a complete bitch by the way, but that's her role, she's supposed to be a bitch. She basically indirectly hits him with that remark where it's like, why does a lab rat need to know why we're doing the experiment? You're just a little puppet that we've been manipulating this whole time, and now you got this big revelation. And it's almost messed up because he doesn't even have time to sit with that revelation. The moment that it comes, he's shoved into the box and he's being discontinued. So it's like, damn, like would you ever expect that out of a kid's horror story? No. So it's very unique in that regard, that you have some philosophical and existential horror stuff for some reason in a kid's horror story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point too. And you know, the sad thing is with this episode is that personally, I honestly would probably give this around the same score as Perfect School. Um, and I guess when we're going into the face off now, before we get into our discussion, this is one of those episodes for me, y'all, where I can care less where it goes, but I think I have a general idea what I prefer, and I'll explain why. But I think based on what we've talked about, Micah, I'm gonna start with you. Um, which one do you prefer? Do you prefer the Perfect School or the Perfect Brother? I think it's kind of
Yeah,
obvious, but
it's pretty obvious from what I've said, but yeah, I prefer Perfect Brother. I just
yeah,
think it is a bit more of an effective story for me. Again, I like that it has that brotherly bond relationship that I think is just really speaks to me a lot. I think I like the dark twist and kind of the concept. Again, the whole concept of your whole family not being who you think they are and turning against you is just such a scary concept. And I just think it's a little bit more effectively done than the concepts in Perfect School. And I think that's just what gets to me the most about Perfect Brother. So for me, I think Perfect Brother's better.
yeah, I can agree. I think the concept is more cerebral, and it's more like more harrowing with the family aspect. So yeah, I can't really fault you there for preferring it for that. So okay, understandable. Um, BD, I think you might be the swing vote here. Well, I guess I am, but I'm curious to hear where you lie with things. What do you prefer?
So usually I'm kind of like the haunting hour champion, because I grew up on it. I do think it is, like, I think in my opinion, the best kids horror show. It has so much great stuff, and without a doubt, Perfect Brother is a very good episode. This is a memorable one. But I think, to me, the way I look at it is I always try to look at a story if I think that it's complete in what it was trying to tell, and it hit all the points that I feel like my expectations were for the story. And I think Perfect School does that. I don't think Perfect Brother hit its full potential. I just think, again, you hit the ground running, which I think some people might enjoy. But when it's a story like Perfect Brother, where you want more buildup, you want more explanation, it almost feels too fast paced. And while it did do some things better than Perfect School, I think Perfect School is just a better package. It just managed its time. It managed to give you something that felt complete all the way through. And while Perfect Brother, I think, ends on a very dark and morbid, note that works, Perfect School made me want more. And it made me feel like I want to see more of the characters, more of the story, and have more avenue to grow. So I'm going to give it to Goosebumps on this one.
I think you put that perfectly at how I feel too. Like the fact that Perfect School makes me want more, which is hard to do. It's hard to do that, really. We get cliffhangers all the time, especially in kids horror. Like they maybe you can pick up where they left off, but sometimes I'm just like I don't care. Perfect School is one of the examples where I do care. Like I would love to see where they go from here because I'm like, does he ever get the kids out? Like what happens next? I gotta find out. Perfect School's one of those examples that just stick with me. Brian O'Connor is one of the most rootable anti-heroes in the genre. I mean, name a more or equally iconic anti-hero in kids horror. There's not many, if at all. He just fits that niche that if you're looking for it, it has it. It has that Twilight Zone esque niche. If you like Cuckoo Clock of Doom, or maybe you like Perfect Brother, or some other stories similar and out there in other kids horror properties, it has that vibe. It has that flair to it. While I do think that the middle portion of the two-parter kind of slags a little bit, I do prefer the episode over the short story. Compared to Perfect Brother, I pretty much give them the same score, and I think Perfect Brother is a better concept, and I wish it had more. If this was a two-parter, I think it would easily go to Perfect Brother. It was able to hit that level of greatness. I think it could have been. I still think it's a great episode nonetheless because it's able to reach those emotional highs. It's able to, still show that existentialism, and it has the double decker twist in the punchline at least to make it memorable. Um, Perfect School, though, like you said, BD, I just think it goes that extra mile into the camp. It goes a little over the top, but in the good way. It has that memorable character, that memorable ending, the fetus tank in the episode. I mean, come on, man. I can't help but love Perfect School. I can't help it, y'all. And I know some people probably were rooting for Perfect Brother to win here. But I'm gonna have to give it to Perfect School too. Um, and it's by like I said, I can go either way. Some days I might prefer one or the other. I don't know, but I think Perfect School is a fantastic two-parter for what it is. I've seen some people say that it's their favorite Goosebumps episode, and I wouldn't blame you if it is. I've also seen people say that about Cuckoo Clock of Doom, so maybe it's more of like a you're looking for that kind of thing. But I totally get it. So I guess for this episode, we're gonna give the win to Goosebumps over Haunting Hour, which doesn't happen a lot. So go figure. We got a Goosebumps W. I don't know the last time Goosebumps got a W, but yeah, we're gonna add another one to the books. If we still had some former panelists, this probably could have gone a completely different way. But it is what it is. Especially you guys out there watching. All right. Um, but yeah, that's just our thoughts. Let us know down in the comment section which one you would put over the other, everyone. So with that being said, I guess we'll get into our discussion and then we'll close out the podcast. So I'm going to give all of the credit here to BD. Before we got on, he's like, all right, what are we going to do for the discussion? I was like, I haven't thought about it. He was like, well, we already going to talk about, how the Perfect Brother could have used a two-parter. So why not go ahead and just make a discussion about episodes across all kids' horror shows that we think either needed or we personally would have wanted to see turned into a two-parter instead. So BD, I'm going to give you the floor first since you came up with this brilliant idea. I'm pretty sure you have a lot of good ideas out there. What episodes come to mind that you've experienced that you want or think needed a two-parter?
Yeah, I think my main picks would just come from, I guess, two primary shows, which is Goosebumps and Haunting Hour. I'm personally of the take that a lot of Are You Afraid of the Dark's episode, because a lot of them were like episode specific and just kind of were their own things that they usually do a good job with time frame wise. But for Goosebumps, some of the ideas that I think could have made for good two-parters is I've always said Calling All Creeps should have been a two-parter. It is known to be one of the best 20-minute episodes, but I feel like a two-parter would have done justice, especially because I read the book quite a while ago, and I feel like the book has enough material to expand it and kind of make you more invested within the characters and situation. The Blob That Ate Everyone could have been a two-parter because oftentimes I feel like that episode kind of flies by like a dream, a similar thing to Perfect School, where the moment I start watching it, I'm like, oh, it's done. Could have made it into a two-parter. But Haunting Hour, that show has a lot of interesting ideas for two-parters. One of the big ones I think all three of us have agreed on that I also agree with is Dreamcatcher. Dreamcatcher is one of the main ones that should have had a two-parter because it is such a fast-paced episode. You can tell from the editing that some stuff had to have been cut out behind the scenes, that we never got like a director's cut or anything extended cut. I would have loved a two-parter for that because there's so much there to chew on. You got the urban legend of the dream catcher. You got the camp. You got the whole idea that, this might have been going on for generations of kids. It's not just relegated to just these guys, You could have had a whole, like, in a way, Freddy Krueger, battle in the dream world kind of thing. That would have all been fun. So you could have done something like that. Um, I think Mascot could have taken a two-parter because Mascot's idea was all over the place. You could tell they were trying to go in a bunch of different directions. They allude to some stuff involving the school, a potential cult, a potential cover-up, but it's never really expanded upon because they knew they only had 20 minutes. I heard there was talks about a sequel, but if you made it a two-parter, you might have not even needed a sequel. You might have just covered everything you could involving that story. Um, and what else do I think could have had a two-part? I mean, those are some of the big ones, the primary ones. I can't think of any other ones off the top of my head, but I feel like those are some of the primary picks. And yeah, maybe I think Alien Candy too. You could have expanded Alien Candy into a two-parter. I brought up the idea of a movie. If we're talking about the idea of it being a movie, Alien Candy had enough of a larger scale scheme going on that a two-parter could have possibly worked. Because I just said Calling All Creeps needed a two-parter, and Alien Candy is like a more crazy version of Calling All Creeps. Even goes a little bit darker with it, so you could expand that. So those are some of my takes, at least the ones that come to my mind.
I think those are some great picks. I especially agree with Dreamcatcher. Stuff like that, Mascot, Perfect Brother, episodes from Haunting Hour, they got kind of butchered in the editing because of pace and runtime. Definitely needed a two-parter, and they had the ideas to facilitate it. Like all three of these episodes would have crushed being
Oh,
a two-parter
and
from
the
Haunting
and
Hour.
these two I'm not going to go into detail, but I feel like anybody who's seen them, you know what I'm talking about. The Girl in the Painting and Brush with Madness. Those two
Yeah,
also could have taken two parters.
yeah, those are other great examples too. Haunting Hour, I think the thing with Haunting Hour is as a show, these are basically like screenplay treatments turned to screen, and I feel like sometimes the writers they had an idea and they got so enveloped in the idea that they are like, maybe we can insert something a little larger in this portion of the story and then mull over it, and often than not it was a great idea, but we as fans wanted more out of it. That's the detriment to this show, right? A lot of the time, you have these crazy ideas that sound cool on paper, but they don't do anything in the story to serve it. And all the examples you just said are well received episodes from the show, don't get us wrong. But if there were two parters, they could have been like elevated to a different level. Like I'm talking a whole different level than what they're perceived now. They could be in the same talks, maybe as potential something like Haunted Mask Part One, Part Two, Werewolf of Fever Swamp kind of thing. But sadly, they weren't. But you look at examples like Creature Feature or Grandpires or Really You from the show, the two parters from Haunting Hour, or Dead Body, Dead Bodies, which was retroactively a two parter. All of those felt extremely fleshed out, bigger, large scale stories that deserved the runtime. Even the Golem had that too. Most of the two parters in the Haunting Hour deserved it. Um, and it just blows my mind that they didn't try to capitalize on that more. Like Goosebumps season per season, I think, including the seasons that had R.L. Stein specials, they often had 4 to 6 a season. So Haunting Hour could have done that if they wanted to. They just didn't. I think, what did they have, like 5 or 6 total? So that's not a lot. Not saying that Haunting Hour needed to trim out the fat, but obviously it comes to mind like episodes like My Robot or Miss Worthington or Poof Day Fromage. You could have put the budget into part twos of more iconic episodes, and then you could have just made the show even more goated than it already is. But that's just hindsight. Hindsight is 2020 essentially on that. So yeah, great picks, dude. I'm gonna pass it over to Micah. Micah, what's your picks for this idea?
Well, I think my main one would be Night of the Living Dummy 2. I think that episode, I love Night of the Living Dummy 2's episode. Like, I will admit that straight out. It is probably my favorite Slappy episode. Just because I do have mainly because I have a lot of nostalgia for it. It's the first episode of Goosebumps I ever watched. But I just think it is a very enjoyable episode. I think it's easily the creepiest Slappy episode. I think there's a lot of great atmospheric moments in it. And I feel like they just kind of rushed it. I feel like it needs to be fleshed out a bit more. You could have part one be solely kind of building the mystery of Slappy, having more of the atmospheric ideas and just kind of building up, what could be going on with him, why, like, is he actually causing all these mishaps and stuff. And you can maybe end on like the closing act one or part one stinger could be like Slappy revealing himself to be alive to Amy. and then the entirety of part 2 is just Slappy, like living Slappy shenanigans, kind of adapting that latter half of the book where Slappy is just fully out there and alive for the whole episode. Because I think that would have been really fun to give us a bit more of Slappy being Slappy, because you don't really get a lot of that in the main episode because you spend most of the episode, building him up, and you only get like 5 or 10 minutes in the climax where he's at his fullest potential. And I feel like you could have expanded upon that a bit more and had a bit more fun with that, kind of like how Night of the Living Dummy 3 does it. But I think that's definitely one that could benefit from a two-parter. I honestly can't really think of anything else off the top of my head, since I know Austin has mentioned a few that I don't want to, those other ones I would agree with, but I don't want to steal his thunder. So,
Well, I was just chiming in. If you have one that you want to talk about specifically, go ahead, man.
Okay, well, I guess then I can maybe talk about, I guess, Shocker on Shock Street from Goosebumps would be another big one.
Yeah, man.
I think that, it's a really fun episode as it is, but, obviously it's a very different adaptation since the budget wouldn't really allow for some of the stuff that they did. I feel like if it was a two-parter, because typically those did have bigger budgets, I feel like maybe you could have done some of that stuff from the books. It may not have looked the best. Like, you could have maybe done the giant praying mantises, because they did giant animals in, like, Deep Trouble. Like, it wouldn't have looked good, but at least you could have maybe had those in there. And you could have done a few more things that were like the books, like the Wolf Boy and Wolf Girl, or like the Haunted House of Horror segments from the ride. Because I think the ride portion of the episode is really fun, but it's also very different from how the book does it. It would have been kind of fun to see the book's version of the ride adapted a little bit more faithfully into the episode, which again, I know is a budgetary constriction, but two-parter, bigger budget. I feel like you could have done a lot more of that. I feel like the ending, I think, was well done. I think the episode actually did the ending better than the book because it fleshes it out a bit more. And it kind of ends on a bit more of a sinister note with what may happen to Aaron's dad. And I really like that extension upon it after the main twist reveal. But I feel like Shocker on Shock Street, again, it could have benefited from having a bit more of that extended. Like, maybe part 1 is like the build up and then the ride itself, and then part 2 is kind of them leaving the ride and experiencing Shock Street and all the other monsters there. I feel like that would have been a good way to separate the two segments out, but I feel like that would have been a really well done, a cool one to see expanded more on.
Yeah, I have to agree with Shocker and Shock Street. I guess we'll go ahead and get into mine because you already alluded to it. My one Goosebumps pick would be a Shocker on Shock Street. Here's why. They have this whole like in-universe meta thing going on with like the reused props and everything. What I think would have been hilarious is if like you get to the point like where if they expanded out to a two-parter, and let's say they tried to be less throw some random shit in there like the book kind of was, and they decided to make a more streamlined plot out of it, they could have easily tweaked the plot thread to be more focused around like a mystery going on with Shock Street Studios and like maybe these movies coming to life. But for the fan service side of things, I think they would have probably leaned more into like reusing props from former episodes. Like, I could have totally seen like the Haunted Mask or something coming to life as like Shock Street Studios movies, or like or like the Wolf Boy Wolf Girl from the book. I think that's what they were. And then the praying mantis, of course, probably would have looked like the blown up lizard, like you brought up. But I think if they had that in there and been kind of faithful, but more streamlined in the story, I think that would have easily fleshed out the episode. And a lot of people seem to think like they wasted their money on stuff like Strain Peas and Teacher's Pet. I still don't understand why they spent money on those when they could have allocated the money somewhere else. Shock Street is probably the episode from Goosebumps that seems like the obvious choice to do a two-parter because of the location. Goosebumps iconic locations generally have two-part episodes. I mean, look at Dark Falls, look at Fever Swamp, look at Horrorland. Even the Deep Trouble Island got a two-parter. Why didn't Shock Street Studios get a two-parter? It makes no sense.
You imagine if they did like in canon thing where in Cry of the Cat, the movie that they're acting out is like a Shock Studio movie, and then it all ties back.
They could have tied it all together there. I think, and that's another fun little lore thing they could have done. But it is what it is. But yeah, Shock Street Studios has always been one that I thought would have been fun. My second pick goes back to what we already talked about. I think Beatty brought this one up. Dreamcatcher. that just needed a two-parter, man. Like I still can't fathom why they didn't go through with it. I think part of it has to deal with the monster being so scary, and I feel like maybe there's some fear of flack for going a two-parter with it. Because I feel like if that single episode was able to scar kids, imagine what a two-parter could do. Seeing this monster just full on display for like 48 minutes or whatever, that would have been crazy.
Although
and
to be fair, Dead Body brought in phone calls to the Hub, and they still made a sequel to that.
yeah, they made a sequel to that. So I don't know. Maybe they were dancing around ice cubes on this one. I don't know, but I think you might be onto something because of how choppy the back half of the episode is. There has to be cut out footage that they were like, nah, we can't put this in there. I'm assuming there is, and if the director is out there watching, if you have this footage and you have this director's cut, if you ever release it, I will not say a word. Just send it to my email, send it to my handle on Twitter, and we'll keep it copacetic. Okay, we'll keep it private. Um, but yeah, that one has always come to mind. I think another Haunting Hour episode that some people probably don't think about for a two-parter that I think would have been fun. Um, I was thinking on it earlier, and I was like, you know what? This one would have been a fun two-parter to see. Game Over. I think Game Over had a big, huge idea that was crazy and bat wild with the whole Game Master idea. I think they could have easily built onto this video game tournament to be something like an MLG tournament that gone awry. Then the winner of the MLG tournament then gets sucked into the video game, and then all this extra turmoil with all these players. They could have added a lot more characters. They could have put a lot more budget into it. That would have probably required them trimming out some episodes from I guess season one, and there's a few in there that I think are expendable. But Game Over is another one that I've always thought would have been fun as a two-parter, just because of how different it feels from the rest of the Haunting Hour. But I think all the other ones we already talked about are also obvious candidates too, like Mascot, Brush with Madness, and all the other ones. Um, and I guess to throw one last one out, just for fun. Are You Afraid of the Dark really doesn't have much, on the table to maybe flesh out into a two-parter. The two that come to mind actually come from the revival seasons, and I can't believe you didn't bring this up, BD, because I think you made a fantastic point on it earlier. Um, I think that Bigfoot Ridge would have been a fun two-parter.
Yeah.
Yeah, with the snow setting, and them fleshing out the Umbra and fleshing out this disappearing person for the first act, which I think was kind of mulled over in the episode for, I guess, time constraint. I think maybe going into the backstory of it all and then building more onto the villain and what they're able to do would have been a crazy addition to it. It possibly could have helped save it for folks that, for some reason, claim it's the worst revival episode for some reason. It is what it is. But
It also
I
had the snow setting, so I gotta milk that.
yeah, you gotta milk it for all it's worth, man. Get that vibe in, and plus, you get Brooke Nevin and Hayden Christensen in the episode. I mean, come on, more of them would have been awesome. Um, but the other episode that comes to mind that I think actually would have been a really cool exploration into body horror, if they wanted to do it right, is Jake the Snake. I think Jake the Snake had enough idea there for a two-parter. Kind of similarly to Mascot when you think about it. There's enough there with the urban legend of Jake taking people throughout the history of this hockey team and giving them the stick that turns them into snake serpent slaves or whatnot. There could have been a way wilder approach to that story that could have been built on. Maybe adding on to, I guess, what would have been the final 10 minutes of the episode. And then, obviously expanding the entire middle to be like the guy's slow degradation into turning into a snake would have been pretty gruesome. I'm not saying go full Teddy from Secret Admirer with it, with like just shocking, body horror effects. But like the guy had his skin falling off and flaking off and stuff like that, and it looked disgusting. They could have easily gone way harder into that if they wanted to, and I would have welcomed it. I mean, it could have been a self-exploration kind of thing for his, mutilations and stuff. But I feel like censors, especially Nickelodeon, probably would have been like, we gotta cut that out. So who knows what it would have turned out? But I think there's enough there to kind of expand on to make a more disgusting horror type of story.
There is one also. I think Are You Afraid of the Dark episode that just came to my mind now that I'm like, I think this one I would want maybe a two-parter for. I'm not gonna go too deep into it because I feel like it's almost self-explanatory. But I, I don't know if people agree with me. I think Midnight Madness could have maybe made a nice two-parter where we get multiple movie monsters instead of just Nosferatu. You could have went a whole like old school horror movie Universal Monsters route with it, and you could have expanded and had Dr. Vink bring in like multiple movies that make him super popular. Um, Maybe even like monsters coming out when you go to a movie theater, they got posters on the walls, monsters coming out the posters and whatnot. So could have done that. Maybe that could have been a nice two-parter.
Yeah, they could have gone the creature feature route a little bit.
Yeah,
Maybe they could have played more into the aspect of getting sucked into a movie too.
true.
Like they could have the movie monsters coming out into the real world, and then one part of the episode they're in the movie, playing in the movie. Play more into that. I don't know how that would have looked on Dark's budget, but
Mhm.
that would have been intriguing.
But I mean, if they cut out one of the lesser episodes, and take that
Yeah,
budget, then maybe it could have been okay.
yeah. What is that? It came out in season 2 or 3. Was
Yeah,
it season 2? Season 3? It had to be around there.
around.
There's a few expendable episodes in those seasons. Maybe not many, but there's a few. Um, so yeah, I think we all have pretty good picks for what we talked about. And I think that we probably left some good ideas that we just aren't thinking right now because we're in the moment. But if you have any better mousetraps out there, put down in the comment section what episodes you think would have benefited or you wanted to see turn into a two-parter, because we're curious to hear. With that being said, I think we are officially done with episode 38. Thank you everyone for tuning in, watching, whatever you're deciding to do with these podcasts. It really goes a long way for you sticking through the whole video. If you liked this podcast episode, please drop a like. It's free to do so. It's free support. Let us know that you're liking what we're putting out. If you want to share this video with others, we kindly appreciate that as well. As always, I'm going to put all of our information down here in the comment section and the description of this video so you can check out all the solo stuff we put out. And we do often collabs together as well. So if you like that, you can check that out. If you are just tuning in for the first time and this is your first Goose Junkies podcast episode, we have an entire playlist on YouTube where you can watch every single Goose Junkies podcast that we have put out. It's kind of growing in popularity again. I'm seeing a lot more people tuning into these retroactively, which is really fun. And I'm glad you all are finding this podcast. I guess for our next episode, because our next one is going to be Halloween weekend. Halloween weekend. We're getting back on track with doing these, I guess, weekly or trying to do these weekly. We have decided to do a face-off that I think a lot of people would be excited for because it involves a relatively recent Goosebumps release, and it's Goosebumps 2 Haunted Halloween, and we're going to be facing it off against a Netflix family horror movie called The Curse of Bridge Hollow. So you're not going to want to miss episode 39 because it's going to be a Halloween face-off for the ages. And does anybody have anything else they want to say before we sign off to our loyal audience here?
No, but until we see you next time, enjoy your Halloween. Happy Halloween.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Happy
Yeah.
Halloween. We'll see
Yeah,
y'all
well,
then.
great Halloween. Stay safe.
And stay spooky.